have to
Yeah,
do.
okay.
And now I hit,
Not all of them get 2 nails. Depends how much you
Okay,
like them.
we're on.
no, that's what I did last
You're
time.
fine, you're good, just leave it. Just leave it.
All right,
Okay.
okay.
Good evening, everyone. This is a special meeting of the Personnel Administrative Affairs Committee. We have started at 6:03. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Yes,
Excuse me, Madam Chair. The button on the recorder.
what?
Are you recording?
What do you need me to hit?
recording?
Is it flashing?
Yeah,
Okay, hit it.
Not tonight, yeah.
okay,
Thank you.
yep. Okay, Alderman Karen,
Here.
Alderwoman Kelly,
Here.
Alderman Clemmons is here, Alderman Lopez. Here. And Alderman Gidge could not be here this evening. Also here this evening is Alderman Wilshire, Alderman Jettie, Alderman Klee, and Alderman Dowd, and Alderman O'Brien.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any public comment? Doesn't look like, so we have unfinished business resolutions.
Yes, R 18073, proposing an amendment to the city charter relative to filling vacancies on elected boards by majority of vote of the remaining members of that board. I would move to take from the table.
Okay, you heard the motion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Would the city clerk, Ms. Piazza, come sit? Okay, do you want to make a motion for final passage? Alderman Clemmons.
I actually have a question. Did we amend this the last time so that so it's the one that came with the agenda, correct? We already amended it?
Yes.
Okay. So I would move to recommend final passage.
Okay, you heard the motion. Any discussion concerning Resolution R 18073? Alderman Lopez.
Well, Alderman Jettie has this version that he just dropped off, which looks like it just, if I understand it right, you were proposing we just, all spaces to be filled would just be filled by the Board of Aldermen?
No.
A lot of crossed out words here, so I wasn't sure what, just honestly.
Okay, before we have Alderman Jettie speak on his amendment, could we have City Clerk Piazza talk about the amendment that we were provided tonight so that we have something to work with? Is that okay? Does anyone have a problem with that? Okay, thank you. Ms. Piazza?
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the recommendation, Patricia Piazza and the city clerk. So the resolution before you was discussed at the last personnel meeting and everything like that, and it was desired to have a special meeting just to deal with the logistics as the amendment was just brought in that evening. And I know that Corporation Counsel did send out an email to everyone. Sue Levering sent out an email relative to the attachment and in the resolution being before you this evening that changed it as far as still the board still appointing for an unexpired term up to 60 days. But it all depends whether or not there's an election scheduled, whether or not it would, so it says if the unexpired declared inauguration, we'd have the election as normal. If elected by the board at the municipal election, the individual shall continue in the office. So if the board should appoint somebody within that 60-day period, they run in that municipal election, then they would continue in that. If not, then that individual didn't run, or if they were not elected, then the individual that received the highest number of votes at the election then would take that term of office to fulfill that term of office until the January inauguration. As far as them talking about a qualified person in Charter 6A, what that just means, it's the registered voter. So if it is a ward vacancy, that means a voter would have to be registered in that ward. Whereas if it's an at-large vacancy, of course, it would be as long as they were registered a registered voter, they'd be able to be eligible to run. Bless you. So basically, that is the gist of it, but the main thing is if a person is an incumbent alderman that is running and they receive the most highest votes, it goes to the individual that is not a current incumbent.
Okay, any further? Oh, Alderman Bryan?
Yes, I open, excuse me, Madam Chair, you open for questions at this time to the
Yes.
clerk? Thank you. I would like to ask the clerk, if she may, can you help us comparatively to the original legislation, the McCarthy original legislation, and how is this different? And I'm really am looking for your opinion. What would make this head and shoulders above the original, resolution that was written?
The original resolution goes back, the original resolution would go back to what was prior to 2005, which allowed the board to appoint a member, to appoint the member to serve the term. So there would be no special election whatsoever, whether it's with another municipal election or not. That individual would fill the unexpired term. Whereas this one, the individual would be appointed within the 60 days and everything, but it would be filled depending on that term at that next special election, at the next municipal election.
Okay, Alderman Clemmons.
From my understanding, from Corporation Counsel, was that that's not how we used to do it prior to 2006. So if you were an at-large alderman filling a term that had 3 years left in it, the board would appoint and then hold a special election for the next 2 years of that term, which is what the amendment before us proposes to do. The way that the legislation was written before this amendment would simply have us fill the vacancy for the whole, for example, 3 years, if that's what was left in the term.
Yeah, so.
I'd have to look back because I wasn't prepared to look at the original before us, so 2007.
If I could.
Alderman Clemmons.
I just know that's a fact because that's how we did having lived in Nashua and been involved in elections and things like that, I just know that that's how we used to fill a vacancy, particularly when it was an alderman at large.
Okay, so Alderman Wilshire.
Thank you. So I guess my question is, as it stands, the legislation would allow us to appoint somebody until the next general election, municipal election.
Yes.
And so here's why I'm asking. So when I first got on the board, or when I tried to get on the board, an alderman at large quit, left, and a ward alderman was selected by their peers to take the alderman at large seat. So that was Fred T. Boom, who left the board. And Tom Grant, who was the Ward 7 alderman, was voted on by the board to take the at-large seat. And then the Ward 7 seat was also filled by the board for the remainder of the term. I guess I'm asking if that's what we're looking to do, is go back to that process. That's it, right?
Okay, Ms. Piazza.
Okay.
So I found the original type of legislation, the original legislation that went back before the 2006, the proposed language, the former charter language relative fill and vacancy of the board before the charter was amended in 2006, which stated that vacancy shall be filled until the next municipal election by the election of some qualified person by recorded votes of at least a majority of all members of the board at the next regular meeting or a special meeting called for the express purpose of filling the vacancy within 60 days following the creation of the vacancy. So that was the exact wording back before 2006. So this just, I think, this amendment that's before you now it does incorporate, so you are correct, Alderman Clemmons, so thank you. I did find that. But this also just expands a little more on it as far as the qualified voter and about an incumbent and everything.
Alderman Wilshire.
Thank you. So what I'm not in favor of is giving the seat to the next highest vote getter. I'm not in favor of that, because it could be someone who got 5,000 votes and someone who got 5. I mean, if it were close, I'd say, oh, it's not a big deal, but the person who got 5 doesn't really have the support, that they would need to do that. So that's just my concern, is that we don't do that.
Okay, Alderman Lopez.
Just to echo Alderman Wilshire's point, I think somebody could just troll the election, like any of the the ward aldermen could just like throw their hat in for the at-larges, not run at all, and then if any of the at-larges had to step down, they're like, get an automatic upgrade. So I think just by allowing the math to automatically choose it, you're not giving anybody a better vote, or you're not giving more rights back to the people. You're just letting an obvious flaw exist within the system where all you have to do is put your name in the hat, and as long as there's only 2 people running, if something goes wrong with the first guy that you lost to, you automatically get his spot.
Okay, Alderwoman Clee.
I agree with both Alderman, Wilshire and Alderman Lopez had to say as far as that is concerned. But I have a question, and I think I know the answer to it, so I apologize for being obvious. But if in this case, I understand that Alderman Clemmons ran for the special election and he'll run again because the term would have been up. But if that term had not been up, in other words, that he had maybe 2 more years on that term, when they run for the special election, do they run as a full alderman at large or just to fill those last 2 years per this legislation?
That would be up to that alderman to decide if they want to run for a vacancy. As you know, there's 3 aldermen
Right,
at-large
right.
positions each year, whether or not they would want to run for the full term, or whether or not they would want to run for the continue on the unexpired term.
But when they've been elected by the board, they're elected to fill that particular seat.
Yeah.
When that seat would come up for election, when?
At the next municipal election.
At the next municipal election. So if there was still like, say, 3 years left on that seat, do they have to run again to fill those 2? Or, because we just said, I understand how it would work with I'm just a little confused as to, in this particular case, it's easy because that position would have been up but if there was still like 3 years left on that, how would that work?
That individual would have to rerun, but another individual could also run because it's a special election. So other individuals could still run for that position. That's why it's within here that the candidate receiving the greatest number of votes, who is not incumbent or who for that office, would receive that seat.
Okay.
So if like 3 people ran, and candidate 1 is currently the candidate that's in office, but candidate 2 beat candidate 1, candidate 2 would now fill that unexpired term and start at the next, once the canvass of votes have been accepted, they would then start at that next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Alderman Dow, did you have a question?
Not a question. I don't have a problem putting in the new language about being a qualified person for the thing. But I agree with Alderman Wilshire that I think when we appoint somebody that they go for the rest of the unexpired term, the way it was before. Because I can see all kinds of perturbations with the way I just heard it described about the person that's got could run for the 2 years, they could run for the 4 years, and then you get somebody new running for the 2-year. It just, we don't need to make this any more complicated than it needs to be. We appoint somebody, they fill the remainder of the term.
Okay, let me, Alderwoman Kelly, please.
Thank you.
And then you.
I actually wanted to go back to the point previous, where we were talking about someone I want to make sure I was understanding clearly, and then there's a point of order that I wanted to ask. So when we talked about this last time, you had said if we have a ballot and we're running a special election, there would be a space for the 3 who are up, but then also a space for a special election. So if I was running, like Ben will have to in the fall, I would either choose to be part of the special election or choose to be part of that full.
If the term is a continuing term. So if the term is not up in January, but is continuing on for another 2 years, then yes.
Okay. And you would just denote that and say, I'm going to run for the remainder of the seat, or I want to run for the full 4 years that's up.
So on that, we would have special paperwork. There would be paperwork for the regular candidates for the municipal general election, and then we'd have the paperwork for the special election. They would both still appear on the ballot. One would say the unexpired term, and then it would be 4 years out, and or unexpired term 2 years out.
Okay. And then just my point of order was I couldn't find the minutes but I thought we only kicked it back to committee. I don't remember actually amending this as it was set in front of us. Because I remember having a discussion about, we got a couple of different versions today, we're not feeling comfortable, let's set it back to committee and talk about it there. But I don't remember ever saying, yes, let's take these amendments in.
I think there was something that we wanted verified by Corporation Counsel, the amendment that we had in hand. So that's why we decided, because he was here, so we asked him if we could push this out a little bit because of the timeline that city clerk has.
Yep.
So I think that's why we asked for some clarification, and that's why he sent, to make sure that we understood what we were putting in for that that change that was taking place, because there was a lot of little nuances that we weren't quite sure about. So we wanted clarification.
Okay. That's
Okay.
not, I remember getting like 2 different versions of this that day and when we kicked it back. All
Right,
I'm
and-
asking is whether we actually amended it or whether we kicked it back before amending
I
it.
think we kicked it back to Corporation Counsel so that they would clean it up
Sure.
and give us a final
Okay.
drafts of that amendment. Alderman Clemmons, you had your hand up?
Yeah, so just so everyone knows, what's before us here does not say that the person who comes in second gets to fill a vacancy. What it says is that the board will fill the vacancy until the next municipal election. So it's pretty clear in that case, because all it does is basically say if there is less than 2 years left in somebody's term, then the board is going to fill that position until the next election. If there is more than 2 years left, still, the board will fill that position until the next election. And so if you have a term that's less than 2 years, like a 2-year or less term, the board will fill it, appoint somebody till the next election. If it's more than 2 years, the board will fill up to the next municipal election, and then the voters will decide the remaining 2 years, the balance of that term. So it's fairly simple in the sense that all it does is make sure that we're never appointing somebody for more than a 2-year period. You know, presumably because we have a lot of boards that are 4-year terms, and there could be the case where there's a vacancy on there, where the remaining of the term could be longer than the general 2-year period every 2 years when we have an election.
Okay, Alderman Lopez and then Alderman O'Brien.
Yeah, well, Alderman Clemmons just explained what I was trying to bring up as well. I would have used more puns. But my concern with what Alderman Dow presented is only that, like, an alderman such as myself, who's like, I have to run in the fall, if there's an opening coming up and it's one that is for an at-large term with 2 more years, I shouldn't be allowed to run for that position. I should be able to run until the next election because my voters only voted for me for here. And there's a big difference between trying to convince other Board of Aldermen people that I want to fill a vacancy and the entire city. So that was my only concern, is that I think, as Alderman Clemmons said, we should only do it for 2 years. and not leave that room for abuse in there.
Okay. Alderman O'Brien?
Thank you. If the board and this committee remembers, I was the sole alderman that spoke in favor of the original R 18073 that was presented. And the reason I did that is I put a lot of trust into its author, and the author was then President Brian McCarthy. And though I wish he could be here to explain the points of view, I think we all could probably agree that he had, and it has been documented, over 25 years' experience on this particular board. That would mean to me that he has seen people come and he has seen people go. And therefore, things that happened to other people, such as our current president has brought up, with the replacement of everybody, it has been done before. Now, whenever you get into a situation, as with contracts and everything else that, one comes up when the gray area occurs, is the test of time of what we call past practice. It has seemed that the original amendment, the original referendum that came through, resolution that came through, has stood the test of time. It has followed up. Now, you keep in mind in the generality, what I heard with that meeting, that when I voted in favor and a lot of you voted against on it, was there seemed to be a lot of confusion on the original amendment. It seems this current amendment is well thought and well written, and I'm not going to throw it out with the baby with the bathwater. But however, I think the original was also equally well written by an experienced member of the board. And the thing is, it goes in to fill the seats. Now, we all run our elections. Some are running twice, such as myself that runs in the state candidacy as well as within municipal. It's a lot, and I think the newly elected Alderman-at-Large Clemens could attest to come in quickly and to fill that vacancy that was left by past President Brian McCarthy. It was a lot of work, and he did a fine job in doing it. But I think by going with the original, kind of eliminates a lot of that quickly that you got to get the fundraising, you got to get the signatures, you got to get a lot of things out. So in the temporary fix, it seems Alderman McCarthy was well thought in going with the original motion. Number one, it was a mirror copy of what was originally the law of this chamber. And number two, it set the time of convenience for the candidacy of the people who were running. And at the end of that person's term, then they may go for the general election that does occur. And I'm so glad it doesn't mention number two taking over, because there are mandates. And number two doesn't take into account the mandate. If the people wanted the number two candidate, they would have made him the number one candidate. There's something to be said to that. So therefore, I like the amendment. I'm not going to anchor it down and cause it to sink, but at the same time, too, I wish somebody could tell me why we have to reinvent the wheel, where the original amendment seemed to have answered the question and was adequate.
Okay. Ms. Piazza, can you answer Alderman O'Brien's question? Isn't this basically the original charter from 2005 or before 2006?
If you look at the analysis that legal did with this amendment and everything, it says that it would provide that the vacancies in the boards are to be filled by a majority vote by the remaining members. Much of the proposed language is the former charter language relative to filling vacancies on the Board of Aldermen before the charter was mentioned in 2006. In 2006, the language regarding filling vacancies on these four boards were put in place, which provide for special elections if more than 6 months remaining in the unexpired term. So that was after the charter. What they state is this amendment further clarifies when the individuals elected to fill vacancies take office, and provides that vacancies also caused by death or declination of prior to inauguration are also filled in the same manner. So if somebody decides to decline the position before inauguration, you would fill it in the same manner. So it's basically the same, it just states that it is clarifying it.
Okay. Alderwoman Kelly.
I have to agree with Alderman O'Brien. I feel like the intent of making these amendments was to make it more clear, but I think that some of the language actually doesn't. And I think calling it simple and straightforward is a little bit disingenuous, because there's a lot of people around this horseshoe who are asking questions, and multiple lawyers who have made multiple revisions to this. So if we're looking at the incumbent language, what I'm confused by is it says, then the candidate receiving the greatest number of votes for that office who is not an incumbent shall compete the remain. It seems like a lot of extra words to say that the person who won gets it. Am I right?
Okay, Ms. Piazza?
So on that, what you have to think about, though, is if it's a current incumbent member of the board that's running. So you do want that incumbent to receive that position. But you are correct, it is going to be a separate race. It would be a separate race on the ballot.
Okay. Alderman Lopez, did you have your hand up?
I guess, I'm not sure, though. I thought the language said that to Alderman Shoshana Kelly's point, it is confusing. I thought that what it was saying was that the person who won the most votes in the follow-up election was the one who won the remainder of the term. Like, step one is appoint somebody to get to the next election, and then step two is whoever wins that election wins the rest of the term.
Correct.
Alderwoman Kelly?
So, quick follow-up to that. The way I'm reading this language makes me think that if someone who is an incumbent on the board runs but wins, they don't get it either. So say someone who's an incumbent runs for the at-large space in the fall, because it says the person who is not an incumbent and gets the highest votes shall complete.
Okay. Let Ms. Piazza.
So in looking at this, what I think what they mean by that, so let's take, for instance, Alderman Clements. He's currently the incumbent. So if he was to be appointed into the position, he's currently the incumbent.
For that position,
that
not for the
position.
board.
Right.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Alderman Dowd?
Yeah, a couple things. One, by the way, if the legislation ever said that the second highest vote getter would get it, I'd vote against it no matter what the words were.
Well, it
So,
doesn't say that.
Sometimes
The original purpose, having spoken with Alderman McCarthy many times about this, was the fact that we were spending a lot of money on special elections. So we were trying to make the situation better and not spend all that money. If you go by this amendment, where we don't appoint the person, say he's got 3 years left, and we don't appoint him for the 3 years, we go for 1 year and then special election. Let's say there's an alderman that does that, and then somebody on the Board of Education, the same situation. All of a sudden, you've got like 3 or 4 elections going. You're verifying signatures for a whole bunch of different elections. When people go in to vote, they're gonna be all confused about who am I voting for?
So, okay. Okay. The point of this amendment is to not have special elections. The point is, as Alderman Clemens stated, someone, whether it's a Board of Aldermen, Public Works, Board of Education, if that term is for 2 years or less, that board appoints them. And then they run at the next municipal election, which is every 2 years. Okay? If it's longer than that, then that person is only in that seat until the next municipal election, and then they either run to finish that term, or they run for a 4-year term of whatever that position is. There's no, this eliminates all these special elections. So it's not us appointing someone to sit. Supposedly, you have an election this November, and that person decides they're moving away. They have a 4-year term. We would appoint that person, but they would only be able to sit on the board, whatever board it is, until the next municipal election, which would take place in 2 years. And that vacancy would have to be filled by either the person we appointed or other people who might want to run for that seat, for that vacant seat. That would be separate from the general election for any other seats within any board.
I understand that, but what I was getting at was the way you just described it. There's 3 years left on the term. We appoint somebody, the election comes up at the end of that year. Now you're gonna have to elect somebody for the balance of the 2 years on that. It's going to be separate than the 3 people running. Oh,
Right.
yeah, it is. It's gonna be a
Yes,
separate sheet,
yes,
a
right.
separate ballot,
No, same ballot.
different page, as I understand it.
No.
No,
It
No?
would be on the same
it would
ballot.
be on the same
Okay.
ballot.
But you're still gonna have to verify signatures differently.
The verification of the signatures would be the same, but it would be additional, because
So
you have that
if-
extra office.
If we
you're
had
running.
appointed the person for 3 years rather than 1 year, you wouldn't have had to have
That is correct.
verify any signatures.
That is correct.
And you wouldn't need the extra counting that's involved. And the other point I was making is somebody's gonna go into the election, have no idea what's been discussed here. And they're gonna go in and, well, how come these 3 are running for 4 years and this person's running for 2 years for Alderman at large? I don't understand. So you're gonna have all that. So I don't know why we're confusing this thing. It worked, as somebody that was involved in city politics while this worked for many, many years prior to 2005, there was never a problem. Again, I don't mind defining the person a little more, but I don't see why we're making this so complicated.
Okay. I'll come back to that. Alderman Clemmons.
Thank you. This is how it worked prior to 2005.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is. Yes, it absolutely is.
The
This
amendment?
this amendment is exactly how the charter worked before 2005. I promise you. I asked Corporation Counsel this question. The city clerk has just answered that for us here tonight. The way that this is amended is exactly the way it worked prior to 2005. The way that the legislation was written, the way Alderman McCarthy had written it, was that it would be different both from the way that the charter is now and different from the way that it was in 2005 and prior to that. In that, it would just plainly fill the vacancy. Now, I love Brian McCarthy to death, and I wish he was here, but you know what? We didn't always agree, and I wouldn't have agreed with him on this one. I would have said, let's change it back to the way it was before 2005, and that's what this amendment does.
Okay, okay, Ms. Piazza,
Just for clarification, because like I said before, before 2005, it did state that the vacancy shall be filled until the next municipal election by the election of some qualified person. So again, the board would appoint, but at the next municipal election, they would then in turn, if it was more than 3 years, go ahead and re-vote on that candidate
probably never happened.
or another candidate.
So one other thing though, if
Alderman Dowd.
we appoint somebody from the current board, a 2-year alderman, to fill the at-large seat, which has 1 year remaining, now we're going to appoint somebody else to fill their position. At the end of that year, there could be an issue with the person being on the board any longer, and I would see people saying, hey, I'm not doing that if I'm on the board now.
Okay, Alderwoman Kelly, then Ms. Alderman Jettie.
So I think that what is being said is this is the same as what is before. It definitely may in its intent say the same thing, but it is not the exact language that was there before. That is correct, right? There's probably a paragraph more of information in there. And I don't think I fully understand why those changes were made and why we didn't just go back to the 2006 the way it was. If it's saying the same thing.
Okay, I'll let Alderman
Attorney Bolton was
Clemmons
there.
answer, because he's the one that,
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, the only real difference is because it had to be changed to update with the, like you had to be a qualified person. I think before the way the charter was written was you didn't even have to be registered to vote in order to run for an office. But now we require that. And I think that has something to do with it. As far as why it was written the way that it was written, I don't know. Other than the intent is that it goes back to the way that the original charter was. For all I know, Corporation Council probably wrote it so that it's more explicit than the old charter was. But I'm guessing.
All right, I'll let Alderman Jettie speak and then Alderman Lopez.
So I just want to remind everybody that what we're doing is we're changing the current system. The current system was changed because people objected to the fact that the board was appointing people as opposed to the voters being able to elect people. And the only reason that we're doing this now is because the special elections have, there's been poor turnout and at great expense, and not only in money, but in time of the volunteer checklist, poll workers, et cetera. So it was in response to that, we said that these special elections just aren't working. People aren't turning out. They're not exercising their right to vote. And so at great expense, so we decided, well, maybe it's not worth doing it that way anymore. But in essence, I remind my fellow aldermen, what we're doing is we're taking away from people the right to elect their own representatives. So by doing this, and I'm in favor of this, we're saying, okay, if there's a vacancy that's created, the board will, in the first instance, appoint a replacement until the next municipal election, until the next regularly scheduled municipal election, so that the voters will have a chance to express their wish as to who they want to represent them, but we won't be incurring the expense of a special election. I think, I've spoken to Attorney Bolton about this. I think what he was trying to do was, bring it back to the way that was suggested by Alderman McCarthy. But there were some questions, like people have brought out. What if a ward alderman is appointed to fill an at-large position? And so now you have another vacancy. And at that election, that next election, if the person that was appointed was an alderman, a ward alderman, now his position becomes vacant. And, does the person who was appointed by the board continue until the next inauguration? Or does he take over immediately? What if the person that's elected, whoever the people have elected, it would make sense to get them in the position as soon as possible, like what happened with Alderman Tenza when he replaced Alderman Dean. He won the election. He was the top vote getter out of the three at-large positions, so we put him in right away. But what if the person that we select isn't elected by the people? Does he continue until the inauguration, or does the newly elected person get in? So Attorney Bolton was trying to answer all of those questions here. And I think what he did, is, does the job. What I handed out to you tonight, I know I should be shot for doing this at the last minute, but I talked to Attorney Bolton. I found the language difficult to understand. For example, it says, so in the new language that he proposes, it says, until the next municipal election by the election of some qualified person, and he added see Charter 6A because of Mr. T-Boom's complaint that qualified wasn't defined, by the recorded votes of at least the majority of all the members of the Board of Aldermen at the next regular meeting or at a special meeting called for the express purpose of filling the vacancy within 60 days following the creation of the vacancy. That's the language that was there before. But then he went on to say, if the unexpired term is to conclude at the inauguration following said municipal election, and I really think there ought to be a comma there, the election shall be conducted in the usual fashion. And I said to him, what does that mean? What's the election being conducted in the usual fashion? And he said, well, you know, the election occurs like it normally does. But then if the individual elected by the Board of Aldermen is elected at the municipal election, so if the individual that was selected by the Board of Aldermen as a temporary wins the election at the regular election, then he will continue in office until the inauguration. If the individual elected by the Board of Aldermen is not elected at the municipal election, so if the voters choose somebody else, then the candidate receiving the greatest number of votes for that office, and we're talking about that election, you know, the person who receives the most votes at the election, so the winner, in other words, who is not an incumbent, who isn't already a member of the board, shall complete the remainder of the unexpired term beginning at the next regular meeting. If the unexpired term continues for an additional period following the next inauguration, so in the situation you have an alderman at large where the term isn't expiring, you know, like in Alderman Clemens's case, if the alderman at large had 2 more years to go, then the municipal election shall include an election to that office for the remainder of the unexpired term. And the candidate receiving the greatest number of votes shall complete the remainder of the term, beginning with the next regular meeting of the Board of Aldermen. So it's, you know, I know it's language that is cumbersome, but he's trying to, you know, dot all the i's and cross all the t's. What I handed out to you today was my feeble attempt at trying to make it a little simpler, but doing the same thing that he said, but just, you know, adding some commas and making it a little clearer.
Chris, Alderman Jettie, what you handed us, though, it only specifies the Board of Aldermen. It doesn't include the other boards that is all encumbered in this thing. I think what Corporation Counsel was trying to do was to make sure that we had all the i's dotted, all the t's crossed, so that anyone looking at it would understand that an appointment was for a specific amount of time, which means the next municipal election, not a special election. And that position, if there were 2 years left on that position, whatever board it is, then someone, whether the person that was appointed to that position runs, or someone from the outside runs, and then they win, then they would take over that seat that come the next o'clock, just like Alderman Dowd and myself, because both of the sitting aldermen had passed away, and that election happened in November, but we took our seat right after the election, and then were inaugurated that January. That's basically what that is saying, but lawyers being lawyers add a lot of information to it, and I know you were trying to make it simpler, but I think that we want to make sure that everyone understands that someone isn't going to get appointed by any board and sit in that seat for more than 2 years. I think that's the primary concern of the voters. As you said, you know, if we're appointing, we're not allowing the people to vote, but we are, because we're only letting that person sit in that seat until the next municipal election, and then they either run or they don't, or they run for something else. So I think that's really what this amendment comes down to, is going back and then making sure that we have all that information out there so that everyone understands it when and if this goes before the voters, hopefully in November. Alderman O'Brien and then Alderman Wilshire.
Yeah, thank you. I know we haven't coming in close, yes.
Yes.
But I just want to say, and not that I say anybody here misspoke, but I too do a lot of research. And I did talk to people in the corporate council, and I said, what was the genesis of the McCarthy Amendment? And I was told it was basically, I don't want to use the term cut and paste, but it was referred back to prior to 2005. And if I may say to Alderman Jettie, you got to keep in mind what really brought us here. When you're in the majority, you're going to win, okay? And when you're not in the majority, you're going to lose, and then the losers come up with other words of favoritism, collusions, and other different things if they're not very happy with the choice. And in this case, where the board does have the authority to pick somebody, and to fill the spot, and you were in the minority, you probably could use some of those terms. Would it be fair? Probably not, because I think we do pick qualified people. Keep in mind, one of the qualifications is to be a citizen of the city of Nashua. So we're actually picking amongst our citizenship somebody to fill the particular position. But in keeping in mind, I feel like we've gone around the rotary a couple of times. I'm not really truly against this particular amendment, but I keep in mind in reading it, my interpretation was crystal clear. Exactly what Alderman McCarthy wrote before, and now we come back to, yes, it is a little bit more friendlier words to it, but again, Alderman McCarthy was well-spoken in the original amendment, so thank you.
Okay, Alderman Wilshire.
So does this amendment, so the person who is appointed, and then we have a special, and then we have a regular municipal election, and someone is elected to that seat, they would take over right away, and the person who was filling in would be out? Is that how it works?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
just checking.
Okay, Alderman Lopez and then Alderman Jettie.
Yeah, as a committee member, I'm inclined to vote for, to recommend final passage for the Bolton amendment, I guess we could call it. Only because it seems to be cooperative in the spirit of what Alderman McCarthy was trying to do. It just specifies more specifically some areas such as if a person dies or if a person wins and then decides they don't want to actually take office. It's just more detail oriented. I appreciate Alderman Jettie's attempt, but it sounds like a lot of the concerns that he had were mostly in the grace of the amendment and some of the grammar, and some of that can be done with Corporation Council. If we do recommend final passage, we do move the process forward, but it seems like we're really just talking about whether we should amend with this amendment or not in terms of context. And I see the wisdom in appointing until the next election, having that election, and then, as Alderman Wilshire just pointed out, if the will of the people supersedes the will of the board, then yeah, I mean, I guess that winner takes the office, as soon as possible. While I understand Alderman Jettie's point about us taking a right away from the people, we're following the same procedure that did that in the first place, that amended this legislation in the first place. And then additionally, you're also taking away rights of the people when you constantly obligate them to vote for officers that they're not turning out to vote for. You can't keep compelling people to give up their day and their job and all that kind of stuff to show up for a special election just because somebody wanted to change the way that replacements happen. Likewise, I don't think we should be looking at trying to take away all elections or more elections that was intended by saying, okay, if there's a vacancy, now the person can opt to run for 4. And that's not what this amendment is saying. It's letting people be appointed to get to the next election point, and then at that next election point, they can choose whether they and the rest of the public can decide, you know what, I'm going to run for the 2-year space, I'm going to run for the 4-year space. It leaves it open. So I think the amendment as it's presented gives us the best return to the value that we had before.
Okay, Alderman Jettie and then Alderwoman just Kelly.
Yeah, I have nothing.
Well, thank you. I'm sure you have something, Alderman Jettie. Alderwoman
Thank you.
Kelly.
I'm inclined to agree with Alderman Lopez. I think that the intent is right. What I think we can do, and I want to point out that this is not a unilateral decision by us, it'll have to go on the ballot because it is a city charter change, is make sure that that language on the ballot is very clear, because obviously we have questions, so I want to make sure it's super clear to everyone who goes out and votes on the ballot that they know what they're voting for.
Okay, so, City Clerk Piazza, isn't this going somewhere to be looked at before it can go to on the ballot?
So what has to happen is it has to come out of this committee, go back to the full board, where the full board would have to vote on it and find it necessary again. As Corporation Counsel Bolton said last time, we would also request another public hearing because of the changes on that. That could really basically be all done in the May meeting, so May 14th, it goes back to the board. Then May 20, not unless it makes next week meeting, but May 14th and May 28th at the board meeting, you can also have at the same time the public hearing. From there, the board has to, if it goes through at that board meeting, they then you guys now have 10 days to get it to me in order to have it 7 days for you guys to have it certified with state law. You guys have to say that it's passed. I certified then to the state, 3 agencies, which is the Department of Revenue Administration, Secretary of State's office, and Attorney General's office. I have 10 days by law to get it to them. They have 14 days by law to notify me they were within receipt of it, and then they have 45 days to review it and file their report back with me. Once I receive it back, I then have 7 days to notify the board, in which you have to have a meeting in order to determine whether or not it does go on the ballot.
Okay. Alderman Clee.
I know I don't get to vote here, I'll vote at the board, but I just want a couple of points. One is that I just want to clarify something, that I don't think this is taking away the voters' right to vote, because in truth, our special elections, not enough people show up, so I don't think they're representative enough of that. But putting all that aside, I agree with Alderwoman Kelly as far as clarity and making sure that everybody understands it, because it is a little confusing, hence my next question. Just so I have it clear, if it were an at-large position, there will be a section that says Alderman at large, pick 3, and then there'll be kind of like a special election alderman for 2 years, pick 1. So there'll be 2 separate, it won't be, pick 4 and the last one gets a position. There'll be 2 separate pieces on the same ballot.
That is correct. It would be 2 because as with any type of election, when we're filling an unexpired term, it would show that term expires. And it would be showing fill unexpired term to January 5, 2020, like it was this year.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Alderwoman Kelly and then Alderman Lopez.
I feel confident enough, especially with your explanation of the additional steps that have to happen, that there's enough checks and balances. So I would like to move to final passage with the amendments that were sent from Attorney Bolton.
Okay. So you heard
Recommendation to.
You heard the motion from Alderwoman Kelly for final passage as amendment. Any comments? Alderman Lopez.
I mean, my comment is just that this is much easier to understand if it isn't like 2 pages of crossed out prior. So I'm sure the public can figure it out if we just give them a straight copy.
Right. Okay. All right, you've heard the motion. Anything else? Alderman Wilshire.
So this does not include Alderman Jettie's,
No,
no.
no.
All right.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, ayes have it. Motion is carried. No, any public comment? Remarks by Alderman. I appreciate you coming to the special meeting. Do I hear a motion?
Motion to adjourn?
Alderman Lopez. Motion to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned at 6:57. Thank you for being on time.